So you and I, we're about to go on a little adventure together. That adventure is going to span 118 years of Tudors, and it's going to be one generation at a time. How does that sound to you? I'll be your host this evening. My name is Christina. Thank you for joining us here at my Tudor era Tapestry. In January of 1520, Marie of Guise was a charming French noble girl of 4 years. She lived in the Duchy of Lorraine in the Holy Roman Empire. Her uncle Antoine was the Duke of Lorraine. Antoine was her father's older brother. Marie's father, as the second son, inherited the family's French lands as the Count of Guise. This title was not as grand as his elder brother's title, but it meant that he was a member of French nobility. He was a mid-level member, not a prince of the blood, but Claude grew up, for a time, at French court. While at French court, as a teenager, Claude made friends with the slightly older Francis, Duke of Angoulême, the now King Francis I of France. Marie's father was not of high ranking, but he knew the right people, and was on the rise. Marie also lived with her mother, the formidable Antoinette of Bourbon. Antoinette was very pious, very Catholic. There had been rumblings of people trying to reform the Catholic Church. They called themselves Protestants, and they were popping up in clumps everywhere, it seemed. A German man named Martin Luther had started his following in Saxony and was rapidly spreading across the Holy Roman Empire. Lorraine was still Catholic. Marie's father was the Count of Guise in France, and France was still predominantly Catholic also. But they, too, had their issues. There were heretical books spreading all over France promoting the Protestant and Lutheran views. Marie's Lady Mother Antoinette had vowed to stamp out that nonsense. She was loyal to the Pope. Marie also had a little brother. Francis was nearly 1 year old. He was a colicky baby. It seemed to Maria that he was a hard one to please, but he was to be the next Count of Guise after her father. The two of them had also recently gained a new baby sister, Louise. Marie's mother had explained to Marie that she was to be her little sister's godmother. She had told Marie that family stuck together. As the eldest daughter, Marie would always be expected to support her family unity, and if she ever needed the support of her brother, the future count, she could expect that in return. Marie liked the idea of family unity, but she did not quite understand why her parents were sending her far away. She would be moving in with her lady grandmother soon. Marie's grandmother had recently retired to a convent. She was not a member of the order, but she lived alongside the sisters. Soon Marie would also live among them. Lady Jane Seymour was an excited 12-year-old in 1520. Her father was going to travel with the king and queen across the channel to Calais. King Henry was bringing a large contingent to meet with the King of France. Lady Jane was more excited than her father was. This was just another business trip for the 46-year-old knight. He needed a new wardrobe, of course. Her mother had insisted on it. He would need to attend dinners and fine events, and her mother had said she did not want him to look like just another country knight. She had ordered his armor polished. He would look like a knight reborn once her mother was through. Jane wished she could attend. Everyone would be there, from both English and French courts. There would be lords and ladies and royalty everywhere. Everyone who was anyone would be there, and Jane wanted to be someone. Even her lady mother was going to stay back in England. None of Jane's brothers were going to attend either, not even Edward. Jane would have to be content to stay at home and mind her little sisters. She did make sure to tell her Lord Father to remember everything and tell her about it when he returned. He was not one to write everything down, but Jane felt secure in his memory. In the early months of 1520, Lady Jane Parker was nearly 15 years old. She was making fast friends at court. Lady Mary Boleyn was newly returned from her several years at French court, and Mary had so many shocking tales of the things that were allowed. It sounded like a completely different world than the pious court of Queen Catherine. Janie couldn't help but blush when she was told about the French king's several mistresses. Of course, the English king had kept mistresses too, but he kept it quiet, or at least behind closed doors. Bessie Blount had been the king's mistress for several years, and Janie had only found out when Bessie produced the king's baby, his only son. Janie planned to make use of her friendship with Mary and find out a little more about her brother George. George wasn't noble. His father was an ambassador, though. He was rising at court just like Jane's father. She had mentioned to her father last time she had supped with him that George Boleyn was just the kind of man she had hoped to marry. She had said that she did not mind that he was not noble. He was a gentleman of the king's chamber, rising at court and from a good family. She thought her father was quite receptive to her opinion. He remarked before she left about how much she had grown since she had arrived at court. Last night she had stayed up late talking with Lady Mary about her upcoming marriage to 25-year-old William Carey, another gentleman of the king's chamber. She had so much to learn, and what better place to learn than from George Boleyn's older sister. In the cool air of February 1520, Anne Boleyn sat reading a letter from home. Her sister Mary had been married on the 4th of February. She was a married lady now, and her mother was keeping watch for a pregnancy. Anne had learned from Marguerite how to avoid such things. She said it was more difficult to avoid once you were married, but she had been married for over a decade with no children, so Anne was sure Marguerite knew what she was talking about. Though she spent little time with her husband out of dislike, and that, it seemed, helped. Anne hoped when it was her time to be forced into marriage, she would at least find a better match, a poet maybe who liked to read. She could be happy with a poet. Mary had written that she was very happy and pleased to be a member of Queen Catherine's ladies. She had written about her new English-style gable hood that was purchased for her, and how welcoming the Queen had been. Anne understood this to mean that Mary was bored and trying to make the best of her situation. She had written that married life was adequate and in some ways quite surprising. Anne made a mental note to ask her to explain when she saw her sister next, and that would be soon. King Francis and King Henry were planning a summit in Calais. It was going to be grand, and Anne was going to be allowed to attend. Mary was going to be there too. She was going to attend Queen Catherine on the journey, and Anne was going to attend Queen Claude. Or, in the event of her indisposure, Marguerite would step in, and Anne would likely attend her. Queen Claude would be very pregnant by then, and probably would be attended to by other ladies who had gone through that experience, like Diane. Anne was excited for the summit, excited to see her father and her sister. She was excited to see the English again, something she hadn't seen since she was 12 years old. England seemed so foreign now, and Anne felt very French. In the spring of 1520, at the age of 1, Catherine Willoughby was blissfully unaware of preparations of her household. She was safe in her nursery with her wet nurse and her governess. The rest of the household was preparing for her parents to go on a royal trip. They were going to go with King Henry, with a large retinue of nobles and knights, to meet with King Francis of France. Kat's father was part of the king's retinue. Maria Willoughby, Kat's mother, was traveling to assist the queen. Maria was Queen Catherine's oldest friend and closest confidant. Daily life for the 1-year-old would not change much. Her days were usually spent with household staff because her parents were busy with their careers. They would be gone on this royal sojourn for several weeks. They would, of course, make time to see their baby daughter before the trip, and soon after their arrival back. She was the light of their lives. Kit was the only surviving child and heir to their vast land holdings. They weren't engaged in her day-to-day upbringing, but they had loved her very much. Kat was too young still to notice their absence or to track the time they spent away, but when they would visit her in the nursery, she would smile and notice the deference her nurses paid to them. In the spring of 1520, Mary Tudor Brandon was busy preparing for a big trip. She was expected to accompany her lord husband Charles and the retinue of King Henry to a summit with the French. She had not been at court regularly. She was a little too nervous about her re-entrance into society. She, of course, had to go. She was the last Queen of France and the sister of the King of England. Her participation was not requested. It was required. On the way, they would stop and see Emperor Charles V. Charles V was her old betrothed. He had been named emperor at the age of 19. If Mary had married him, she would be the 24-year-old Holy Roman Empress right now, a job that still had a vacancy. This was not a drill. Mary would miss the children, of course. They would be staying home in England. Mary would not be able to navigate her re-entry to court and her children. She would be expected to host parties with her sister-in-law Catherine, and of course encourage discussions between her sister-in-law Queen Catherine of England and her former stepdaughter Queen Claude of France. That had been the whole point of her first marriage, connections, especially when it ended before producing any heirs. Mary did wonder what her life would have looked like if she had produced an heir and she had become the lady mother of the next King of France. She had decided long ago that she would not have enjoyed that life. She saw that her sister Meg had struggled with it all these years. She much preferred her quiet life away from court. Mary finished overseeing the packing of her trunks and kissed the children goodbye. This was the longest she would have been away from them since she had married Charles. In the summer heat, Anna von Euler-Kleefberg sat with her nurses in the garden of her family home. Anna could not imagine a prettier place than the German principality she called home. Anna had given up her quest to become more like Sibylla. Sibylla would always be older. She would always have a 3-year head start. What Anna could be was obedient. She was very obedient, helping the nurses with younger children, being quiet and polite. She jumped at every opportunity to make others comfortable. Anna's mother's ladies had noticed the change in her behavior, and they had commented how grown Anna seemed these days. At 5 years old, there could be no higher praise. Anna basked in the glow of that compliment for days. She was shining on her own, and people were noticing. Catherine of Aragon, Queen of England, traveled somewhat reluctantly to Calais in the early summer of 1520. Just after the departure of her nephew, Charles V, from England, the King and Queen left for Calais to parley with the King of France. Catherine had been hoping for an alliance between her husband's kingdom and her nephew's empire. But Henry's chancellor, Cardinal Wolsey, had been pushing for a French alliance, and the two, at present, seemed mutually exclusive. So here she was, preparing to meet with the King and Queen of France at the Field of Cloth of Gold. She had brought with her a rather large retinue, even bringing some of her newer ladies. New ladies were always an unknown. After having Henry's son, Bessie Blount, was at court less, Henry had found a suitable match for her service to the crown. She had been married to Gilbert Talboys, a future baron. Catherine assumed Henry still dallied with her on occasion, but for the most part she was not much of a problem for the Queen any more. Henry was more preoccupied with her son now. Catherine did need to keep an eye out on the new young ladies at court. Among the new ladies were 15-year-old Jane Parker and 21-year-old Mary Boleyn. Jane Parker was a little younger for the nearly 29-year-old king. Catherine probably had a couple of years before she would be a serious threat. But Mary Boleyn, in contrast, was 21, beautiful, poised, and married. She was married to William Carey, one of the king's gentlemen. She was available to the king at nearly all hours, and Henry was not opposed to sharing the wives of his gentlemen. Catherine would need to keep an eye on her. Both of these new young ladies were with them on this trip to Calais. Mary seemed most comfortable, having lived at French court until late last year. She had barely had time to miss it, and her sister was there, a 19-year-old named Anne. The Field of Cloth of Gold was really a marvel. There were grand tents and fountains of wine and revelry around every corner. Catherine found herself keeping company with her counterpart, Queen Claude of France. Queen Claude was just trying to stay comfortable at this summer event. She was just 20 years old and very pregnant with her 5th child. Catherine felt pity for the dear child. She was so young to have endured so many pregnancies. She looked exhausted to Catherine. But there was joy as well. Though she had lost her eldest daughter, Louise, at the tender age of 3, she had 3 living children with another on the way. Princess Charlotte was 3 years old and had replaced her sister in the betrothal to Catherine's nephew. Prince Francis was 2 years old, and Henry had high hopes to betroth their daughter Mary to him. That betrothal would make Catherine's daughter the next Queen of France, though Catherine would prefer she be the next Queen of Spain. Prince Henri had just turned 1 year old. He was still young for a betrothal, but it would only be a matter of time. And by the look of Queen Claude, Catherine expected she would have her next baby in just a couple of months. Surely she was nearing confinement. Both Catherine and Claude had a few ladies who were attentive and watchful over their queens. The younger ladies were flitting this way and that. 28-year-old King Henry and 25-year-old King Francis seemed both friendly and competitive with each other, trying to outdo each other. But by the close of the summit, they were future in-laws, with Claude's son Francis betrothed to Catherine's daughter Mary, and Queen Catherine was relieved to return home to England. Four-year-old Princess Mary Tudor was preparing for a kind of recital. Her Lord Father and Lady Mother had just returned from a summit in Calais. This summit had been important for peace. Before it had even happened, Mary had been betrothed to the Dauphin of France. They would be married and their children would rule England and France. But Dauphin Francis was only 2 years old. Still a baby. Mary was 4. She could ride a pony and play the virginal. Her lady mother had explained to her that 2 years would not feel like such a difference when they were grown. Today she was dressed in her prettiest gown to play the virginal. She was playing it for her parents and French delegates. They had come with her parents when they had returned from Calais. Now she was to show them the musical skills their next queen possessed. Mary's governess, Countess Pole, had reminded her of her court etiquette and encouraged her in her skill at playing the virginal. Princess Mary entered the hall when she was announced, and she greeted the waiting company. She smiled shyly at her lady mother, who nodded encouragingly, and she sat down to play. The recital went smoothly. Mary made a few mistakes, but in the end, it was a very impressive display. Everyone had told her so. France was pleased with their future queen and her upbringing. Countess Pole was very pleased with how her charge had done. Mary wondered what 2-year-old Francis was required to do to prove to England that he was worthy. Lady Catherine Parr was a verbally precocious 8-year-old in August 1520. She could talk for hours if she had someone to listen to her. Most of the time her audience was her siblings and her governess. Sometimes also her lady mother. This summer had been exciting, and it gave Cat so much to talk about. Her mother had accompanied the Queen to Calais for a grand summit with the French. There had been fountains of wine and jousting. The King and Queen of England had met with the King and Queen of France. Cat had begged her mother to be allowed to go. Her mother had said no. It was not a place for children. Princess Mary had not been allowed to go either. Cat had heard from her mother that Princess Mary would be playing the virginal for the visiting French delegates. She was to be married to their prince someday. Cat pondered for a moment what she would do if she had to exhibit a skill for a group of delegates. Reading was what she was best at. Maybe she could read poetry aloud. Yes, that was what she would do. She had a lovely speaking voice. In mid-August 1520, Queen Claude labored in the French heat. She was a mere 20 years old, and this was her 5th labor in as many years. Louise had been born when the Queen was just 15 years old. Princess Louise had been frail. She had gotten ill and died at just 3 years old. Princess Charlotte had been born just 14 months later, just 10 days after Queen Claude had turned 17. Charlotte was also frail, like her sister, but she had, so far, escaped the looming dread of fatal illness. Prince Francis had then been born to 18-year-old Claude, giving France an heir. Prince Henry had been born when Claude was 19, and France had a spare. This labor gave Claude a sense of calm. The realm did not need more babies. This one was for Claude. It did not matter if this baby was a boy or a girl. When Queen Claude brought forth her baby, at the urging of her ladies, she was a girl. They named her Madeleine. She was born in the wake of the field of cloth of gold. She represented a new peace. Claude clutched her rosary and said a prayer that this daughter would not be as frail as her sisters, but strong like her brothers. Lady Margaret Pole was 47 years old in the fall of 1520. She had taken a break from assisting the Queen, and moved to assisting the Queen by rearing her daughter, Princess Mary. Maggie had accepted the role of governess to Princess Mary, the heir to the throne. Maggie's children were grown now, and they had all done quite well for themselves. Maggie was using some of the skills she had learned in her 28 years as mother to instill good qualities in this princess. Maggie made sure to tell the princess every chance she got about the powerful women in her history. Whether they were Lancastrian, York, or Spanish, she came from some very powerful women. This princess was born to be queen, and Maggie was to do her best to make sure the little girl understood that. Henry and his wife Jane had added to their small family. Catherine had a little brother now named Thomas. Maggie had suggested the name Henry after the king, of course, but they had declined in favor of Thomas. Maggie did not understand why. There were several acceptable names that would have signaled loyalty, but she also understood the trouble names could bring. Thomas was not the best choice, but it was a safe choice. Ursula had also just delivered a baby, her first. She had traveled to be at the Field of Cloth of Gold earlier this year, despite being already in her 4th month of pregnancy. Maggie had been comforted by the thought of her being safe in the household of the Duke, but some of the travel decisions had made her wonder. All had gone well. Ursula had delivered her first baby safely, a little lordling that they had named Henry. Maggie had, of course, approved of the name choice. The baby was named after his own father, Henry Stafford, but it was also a nod to King Henry. It was good to be named Henry in the age of the Tudors. In the early winter of 1520, Margaret Tudor, Dowager Queen of Scots, received some disappointing but not surprising news. Her husband, Archibald, had just welcomed an illegitimate child with his longtime mistress, Janet. Meg tried to be thankful that her daughter, Margaret, would have a sibling nearby. Her brother was king and not available to her often. This new baby would be living with her and their father. But what Meg truly felt was anger. Anger at her husband for having this baby. Anger at Janet that she was going along with it. Anger at her brother who would not permit a divorce and had a new illegitimate child of his own. Anger at God who had allowed her destiny to turn out this way. As soon as the thought crossed her mind, Meg felt guilt and knelt at her altar. This was not God's fault. She never should have allowed that thought any air. God did not control the actions of men. Men did what they wanted, and often that was having babies with mistresses. Meg's newly strengthened relationship with the regent had its perks. John Stuart had power, and Meg had his ear. Now John was charging Archibald with high treason. Somehow Meg felt that this could help her in her quest for a divorce. It seemed to Meg that at this point she had no other choice, except to play the games of men. She would smile to their faces and tell them what they wanted to hear, unless she was sure she could win. You can share your thoughts with me at longlivethequeenpodcast@gmail.com. Slide into my DMs on Facebook or Instagram at Long Live the Queen Podcast, or join the party on Patreon, where we have extended episodes and bonus content.